Shalom and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing the Israel Apartheid Week and we'll be exposing the lies and the hatred that is behind this movement. Warm welcome to the programme, and my guest today is my very good friend Michael McCann, the Director of Israel Britain Alliance. Michael, welcome back to the Middle East Report.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here, Simon.
Excellent. And Michael, you've had a very successful campaign in terms of putting pressure on the British government to ban Hezbollah, both the political wing and the military wing. Can you share with us how successful this campaign has been and give us an update?
Sure. Let me first of all apologise for my dishevelled state, Simon. I'm just off a train, an overnight train from Glasgow, so not quite as spruced up as I would have liked to have been, but delighted to be here. The Hezbollah campaign was very successful. People often use the phrase that Rome wasn't built in a day, and certainly campaigns don't get the immediate outcome that you would like, but we did work very closely with our friends of Israel inside Parliament, and there was a debate that was well attended by people from across the House of Commons on the 25th of January. And that was designed to smoke out a number of things. First of all, the Prime Minister announced after one of the terror attacks in London last year, that outside Downing Street, that we're far too tolerant of extremism in our country. And she was absolutely correct. One of the ways that we're tolerant is that the people have this Al-Quds rally, which we know is an Iranian-inspired event, which is against Israel, and it was walking down the streets of the centre of London last June, just a couple of weeks after the horrendous attack at London Bridge, where a number of people were murdered and a number of people were seriously injured. And these people were walking down our streets with the flag of Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is a notorious terrorist organisation that has carried out numerous attacks on people across the world, notably sponsored to take out Jewish people, wherever they are in the world. We know that the Iranian state wants the Jewish state to be wiped off the map, for Israel to be wiped off the map, and yet people are walking down the streets of our country with their flags waved above their head. It's an absolute outrage. So the campaign was to highlight the nonsense that the government seeks to differentiate between the political wing of Hezbollah and the military wing of Hezbollah. They're one and the same thing. And time after time in the debate in the House of Commons on the 25th of January, MPs from Labour, MPs from the Conservative side, the government side, highlighted this point. And the government minister, quite frankly, was floundering in the day because he kept on trying to make this distinction, which people, quite frankly, found utterly risible. But one of the interesting things that came from the debate was this. Matthew Offord MP and Louise Ellman MP pointed out that they'd contacted the police, and the police had told them, and even showed them QC's advice, that there was no way of stopping these events taking place. However, when the Minister responded, Ben Wallace from the Home Office, he quoted the law and said that the police could stop these events and stop the terrorism being paraded down the streets of our country. So therefore, that was a major breakthrough, and we hope to use that as a platform for a further campaign ahead of the next Al-Quds rally, which is planned for London for the 10th of June this year.
And on that subject, it seems crazy that the government refuses to ban the political wing of Hezbollah, because we know it's an Iranian-sponsored terrorist organisation, one of the most dangerous terrorist organisations in the world, plus also they're genocidal and not only pose a threat to Israel's security, they pose a threat to security in Lebanon and also in Syria as well, and they're nothing but an agent of the Iranian regime with international terror networks. When is the government going to realise that, that these are people you don't negotiate with?
Well, I don't know when that realisation is going to be kicking in, but I think there was a number of powerful contributions made on the day, not least from people who quoted Colonel Richard Kemp, someone who was at the heart of the government security operations, and also quoting Lord Dannett, who was a previous Chief of Staff for all of our armed forces, who were making the point that there aren't any decent law-abiding elements to Hezbollah. They are simply one single terrorist outfit. And there was another MP, Colonel Bob Stewart, people may remember him from the Bosnian war, but Colonel Bob Stewart said there may be some reason that the government want to keep this door open in case there's opportunities to get peace or to exploit better relationships. Well, the fact that you've got Colonel Richard Kemp, who was at the heart of security operations, and Lord Dannett, who was leading all our armed forces, who are turning around and saying this organisation must be proscribed, surely tells you, when they had access to every piece of information in those positions that they previously held, that if they believe it's time to prescribe the whole organisation, then the government should do that.
Let's have a look at the campaign video produced by Israel-Britain Alliance called Ban Hezbollah.
There is, to be frank, far too much tolerance of extremism in our country. We need to become far more robust in identifying it and stamping it out. The whole of our country needs to come together to take on this extremism.
We agree with the Prime Minister. There is far too much tolerance of extremism in Britain. And here is an embarrassing question. Why does the British government allow people to walk down the streets of Britain with Hezbollah flags? Hezbollah is an international and genocidal terrorist organisation. It is controlled by the Islamic Republic of Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of international terrorism. It is responsible for terrorist attacks across the world. And in June 2011, the Special International Tribunal for Lebanon charged Hezbollah leaders with direct involvement in the brutal murder of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri. The Arab League, Bahrain, Canada, France, Japan, the Netherlands, the United States of America have all outlawed Hezbollah. Why hasn't Britain? Click the link at the end of this video and contact your Member of Parliament to ask them to attend the debate and support the full prescription of Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation. The Prime Minister is correct. Sadly, we do tolerate extremists in Britain. It's shameful and it has to end. Let's do the right thing and let's start by outlawing Hezbollah. Michael, thank you for letting me be part of your campaign. But it's so important, isn't it, that our viewers get involved in these campaigns, write to our political representatives and hold them to account, and just shows you the difference when everyone comes together under one coordinated campaign such as this one.
Well, I was going to say that we managed to secure the services of an up-and-coming narrator for that particular video, but I've got some fantastic news to tell people about the Hezbollah campaign, because we hit new highs. Every time I come on your show, I'm lucky enough to be reinvited. I keep on telling you that the numbers for the campaigns increase time after time. A real landmark was secured in the Hezbollah debate. For the first time ever, 10,000 people wrote to their MPs, copied those emails to the Home Office, who are responsible for outlawing and prescribing terrorist organisations. Never happened before. So 10,000 emails, over 10,000 emails were sent, and that takes a real powerful message to the heart of Parliament. So I always get emails from Revelation TV viewers after a programme is shown in the channel. And please, if anyone is watching this and they want to know how to do it, then please go onto the website, www.israelbritain.org.uk, press the button that says our current campaign, and join with us to make that 10,000, 20,000, and then 30,000, and so on. Together, we're really making a difference.
Fantastic. Now, your latest campaign is to confront what is known as the Israel Apartheid Week, and this is their 14th annual or week of Israel bashing and Israel hatred. Can you tell us about how Israel Apartheid Week was founded and the damage it does to Israel, essentially?
Well, supporting Israel isn't an easy task. As Christians, we've been faced with a huge challenge. It's been given to us, but it's a challenge that we will meet, and it's a challenge that will eventually lead to our victory. Israel Apartheid Week started in 2005 in Toronto, and every year it's grown. And this is why I took the view that the Israel-Britain alliance was needed, because our opponents are well organised, well financed, and they are dedicated. People are dedicated to evil just as much as people are dedicated to peace and truth and reconciliation. And sadly, there's a lot of people out there who want to promote an agenda which vilifies and demonises Israel. So it started in Toronto and it's grown year on year, but they didn't choose the words Israel Apartheid Week by accident. They chose the words because by making a link that Israel is apartheid, it takes it back to the most well-known apartheid regime, which was South Africa. And South Africa and apartheid, which treated people differently because of the colour of the skin, that was defeated through a succession of boycotts. It was boycotts in terms of economics, it was boycotts in terms of academic boycotts and sports boycotts. So when South Africa was thrown out of the Commonwealth in the early 60s, and then the campaign increased year on year and included people not buying their goods, that's exactly the analogy that the people who started Israel Apartheid Week set up to construct. And then what they then do from there is that they then encourage people to take the same action against Israel. But here is the real key to their aims and objectives. They are just the same as Iran. They're just the same as every anti-Semitic outfit on this planet. They seek the destruction of Israel because these people chant that famous or infamous phrase, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They chant that because they don't want Israel to exist, and that's the fight, that's the challenge that we must now face.
Absolutely, but also when it comes down to this so-called Israel Apartheid Week, which is spread throughout quite a few weeks, so it's not actually a particular week, and part of the campaign, it's a global campaign to raise awareness of so-called Israel's apartheid policies, and we know they're all lies, we know this is all rubbish. But the trouble is, though, isn't it, is that they hold these at universities now, and they're brainwashing so many students into believing their lies and being part of their hatred, that our universities now are becoming completely intolerant of anything regarding truth. How have they managed to influence universities and student unions by holding these outrageous university events known as Israel Apartheid Week?
There's no secret about why they choose these venues, because they want to get into young minds. They want to, universities have always been a boiling pot, a melting pot of all different sorts of individuals, but there's a lot of extreme organisations. The folly of youth, I would describe it as, when people always say that old phrase, if you had an old head and young shoulders, then what a better world it would be. But the situation is, there's a lot of gullible minds, there's a lot of young people who do not know a lot about the world, and they go in to an environment, a learning environment, and they learn lots of different things. Many of those things will hold them in good stead as they progress through their lives. But the problem is that university campuses, and the reason they choose these campuses is because they can then put up the argument. This is about free speech. This is about people thinking for themselves, debating issues and coming to conclusions. No, it's not. We wouldn't allow people to have debates in universities that said that white people were better than black people, would we? Of course we wouldn't. We wouldn't allow to have debates that would say, is there a case for euthanising people who are disabled? We wouldn't allow those debates to take place. Yet the anti-Semitism that runs through these events suggests that you can start off a debate on a premise that Israel is an apartheid country, which it clearly is not. So that's a fun, if you enter into the debate on those subjects on that banner headline, you are then accepting the premise of the argument. And that is fundamentally wrong. But we started last year with a campaign which highlighted to education ministers. Bear in mind that education has devolved in our country, so there's one in Northern Ireland, one in Scotland, one in England and one in Wales. We started off asking MPs to contact their education ministers and to remind them of what was called the public sector equality duty, where people have to be treated equally and you're not allowed to treat minorities any differently in public areas. So universities are covered by that legislation. And then we also targeted university vice-chancellors in Universities UK, because how many people would know who the vice-chancellor of a university was? These people have never been subjected to any publicity whatsoever. So that's the foundation that we build upon. This year we move it on to a different platform, which is about getting the government to recognise that they must do more to ensure that these events cannot go ahead because they're fundamentally racist.
Let's have a look now at some of the campaign propaganda put out by those behind the Israel Apartheid Week.
Join us and endorse the only non-violent strategy that stands a chance of breaking this cycle of insanity and violence. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions Free Palestine.
We fully support the boycott of apartheid Israel and call on all South Africans to stop visiting Israel.
This week, the American Studies Association voted to endorse a boycott of Israel's academic institutions.
Now, I understand that this is a big deal in Europe. They've been part of this boycott for a long, long time. But this is the first time I've seen it come to America. I'm just astonished that 5,000 American academics should vote to boycott Israel.
President Evo Morales of Bolivia says he's breaking relations with Israel over its invasion of the Gaza Strip.
Breathe the fresh air of freedom. Experience in your high school, in your university years, to fight for democracy.
Apartheid is a legal term. It comes from the 1973 UN Convention on Apartheid. We're using this according to its legal definition because we believe that Israel is an apartheid state, and we urge people to come to events to actually see what our analysis is.
It's about taking big, long strides towards justice, for it is about boycott, divestment, and sanction.
Watch the video there. They never explain what apartheid is, and they don't even say why they call it Apartheid Week, which is astonishing. I mean, seeing that video there, and I wanted to show it for their propaganda's sake, peddling lies and information, but they can't even, in a promotional video, say why Israel is allegedly an apartheid state. They haven't got any facts to back up with what they're saying.
Yeah, because it isn't. And, you know, what they're trying to do is they're trying to conflate two issues, because you have the state of Israel, where everyone has a right to vote, that 20% of the population is Arab, that that population can vote. We know that we've got Arab members of the Knesset. You know, was there any, in white South Africa, was there any suggestion that there was any black people going to get elected but in a one-person, one-vote system to their parliament? Of course it wasn't. And then, in addition to that, you've got the whole question of Judea and Samaria, or what some people like to call it, the West Bank. The position, and in Gaza, the position in the West Bank is that military law prevails, and it's a different system of law. But the reason that prevails is because, if people will remember, going back, and some of your viewers I know will remember this, 1967, the events that took place, a miraculous way that Israel won that victory, is that when Israel moved into that land, the position was they took it over, and then the UN Security Council passed Resolution 242, which said about exchanging land for peace.
Yeah.
But the people who had just lost when they lost in 1948, then they lost again in 1967. They didn't want to make peace because, of course, they started the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and then when they realised they couldn't defeat Israel militarily, they then moved on to terrorism, and then they moved on to a hybrid of terrorism and diplomacy, which we now see, which is something which is bizarre that the international community even falls for these things. So what they're trying to do is conflate the two different situations between the military-controlled West Bank, which comes from that time, in the late 1960s, and Free Israel. Now, the problems and the reason that those issues haven't been resolved is entirely on the platform or on the lap of the Palestinians, because they've never wanted peace. They don't want peace. They keep their people in penury while their leaders live lives of luxury. And quite frankly, until their own people realise they're being used as cannon fodder because of the misguided views of their leaders, then this problem is never going to be resolved.
And talk about our university campuses. I mean, Israel Apartheid Week is something that any Jewish and Israeli student will find shocking, primarily because they reenact, they play games essentially acting Israeli soldiers, so-called oppressing the Palestinians. And what it does is it fuels this hatred towards Israelis and Jewish students, but also then crosses over that line into anti-Semitism and just justifies attacks on Jewish students already, currently Jewish students already feeling very much under threat, and to actually allow Israel Apartheid Week to take place at our universities, isn't this a threat to academic freedom of expression?
Well, you've just explained very articulately, Simon, the campaign that we started last year about the public sector equality duty and the responsibilities that public bodies have to ensure that minorities and views are protected. And I'll go even one step further, that the words Israel Apartheid Week are anti-Semitic, full stop, because the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance determines that describing Israel as a racist endeavour is anti-Semitic. And now we then come back to, we've talked about Hezbollah and how the Prime Minister said that we're far too tolerant of extremists. Yes, we are, Prime Minister, and what are you doing about it? At the moment, not very much. And we're having to campaign and press you hard to make decisions on issues like that. But in addition to that, on the 12th of December 2016, our Prime Minister made another speech to a Conservative Friends of Israel lunch in which she said, we're going to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. That definition, as I explained, means that you can't use phrases like Israel Apartheid Week because they are fundamentally anti-Semitic. And yet, in our universities, funded by public money, funded by taxpayers' cash that we pay in week on, month on, year in, year out, people, extremists, are being allowed to hold these events. So not only are they failing in their public sector equality duty, they're actually breaching the IHRA definition, and by dint of that, they're breaching the commitment that the government has made. Now, what are the government going to do about it? And now you come into that territory which is called political correctness, something that, quite frankly, has overrun our country in the last number of years, where, you know, people have got mixed up about, you know, they can't say the truth without being accused of being, you know, somehow that they're not politically correct. The position is this: universities have a duty, they know they have a duty, but they're terrified of stopping events in case they're accused of preventing free speech. Now, as I said earlier, you couldn't have a debate in a university saying that white people were better than black people, or that able-bodied people and somehow should live and disabled people should be euthanized, or, you know, some crazy argument like that, but yet we allow anti-Semitic events to take place. It's got to stop, and that's why our campaign, again, we'll do this for however long it takes, but this year the campaign focuses on that definition and says to the government, you must now intervene. And we're going to keep a log of every single university that holds an anti-Semitic Israel Apartheid Week event. And once this week, which incidentally, Simon, as you referred to earlier, is now 6 weeks, once these events are over, then we're going to present that to the Prime Minister at 10 Downing Street to put further pressure on the government to match their words with action.
Yeah, because I remember Theresa May, our Prime Minister, announcing with tremendous success this new policy to adopt the international working definition of anti-Semitism that now says that you cannot single out a Jewish person to attack their characteristics, but also includes, as you rightly say, that classification of Israel as a racist state or an apartheid state, which fits in that definition. So if she's come out and said this is what we're adopting, and she was boasting that Britain was one of the very first nations in the world to adopt the IHR working definition on anti-Semitism. Who's there, apart from you, making sure that she lives up to her promises and ensures that she actually implements this working definition?
Well, when I was in politics, I from time to time get disillusioned about the fact that people said a lot of things and didn't deliver on their words. And the longer I'm out of it, sadly, I could get more cynical about the lack of delivery. But the truth is, it's our responsibility to keep our politicians honest. When they make their promises in their election manifestos, and for example, that's why we ran the Pledge for Israel campaign, asking people to sign up to a series of commitments about Israel. And therefore, we have to keep them honest. It's our responsibility. So I never put Theresa May's arm up her back and said, you must agree to the IHRA definition. To my knowledge, nobody did that. Theresa made that announcement because she recognised that any type of racism and hatred within our society is unacceptable. Sure, we can have disagreements on a whole range of different issues, but as long as they're done within the confines of the law, or the constraints of the law, then that's how it should work. The situation is that a racism is taking place here. Anti-Semitism is not called the oldest hatred for no reason. A racism is taking place, and it's been excluded in the normal way that such hatred would be dealt with by the law. In Scotland, incidentally, before then, there was 2 sectarian crimes reported a day, which led the Scottish Government to the conclusion that legislation was required. In terms of the attacks, we saw a woman being attacked on a bus because she was a Muslim, but she was pregnant. And she's seen all sorts of abuse. The woman who carried out that attack was given a jail sentence. So therefore, why is it we're treating this racism different from any other racism? Anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred. It has to be outlawed. And last year demonstrated, and the more these events take place, it ensures that there is only one answer, and that the government have to legislate, and we are responsible as the citizens of this country to put pressure on the government.
Absolutely. Talking about the issue of academic freedom of expression, I mean, what we've seen in recent years is that any Israeli speaker speaking about Israel, speaking in defense of Israel, really essentially telling the truth about Israel's situation in the Middle East, are actually shouted down. I mean, we've had many Israeli diplomats from the embassy going to universities, and they are heckled and heckled and heckled to the point where they're not able to say something. Now, doesn't this pose a bigger problem in a sense that our universities, and I had problems when I was at university over 20 years ago in Manchester, with the Islamic Society trying to ban JSOC, the Jewish Union, because of its ties with Israel. And this lack of tolerance of anything that is an alternative viewpoint, particularly when it comes to Israel. So surely this is in the interests of the heads of academia to actually sort this out, and the government to sort it out, to make sure that our universities are tolerant, but also allow different perspectives, and that people are not hounded because they just want to say the truth.
Well, everything you say is completely accurate, and whilst there are many societies that operate without any difficulty whatsoever across the campuses, the university campuses in the United Kingdom, there is always an element amongst university campuses which are taken over by extremists. And you get organisations that are set up where they say they believe in free speech unless it's something they don't like. And there's topics that the hard left in particular take over. Yeah. And the Trotsky elements, which is what they do, is the Trotsky game plan is pretty simple, is they have a range of issues. And they will start campaigns on various issues. You know, in my time it was, say, a campaign against domestic violence. Doesn't sound as if there's anything wrong about that, but what they do is they draw in people through the headers and the headlines and the banners, and then they indoctrinate them into all these other hard left extremist issues. And Palestine and the whole concept of Israel are an issue that extreme left have got their tentacles into, and they've got no intention of letting go. And incidentally, it doesn't just apply to the students. The academics in many of these universities will offer the same arguments. I was in a debate last week through the Pinxer Society with some academics, and I heard this one professor said in an argument against me, where I was arguing that Donald Trump was right. Is right to move the American embassy to Jerusalem. He made the point, you've damaged the peace process. Now, I just let the pregnant pause lapse after he said that. I said, what peace process? Have I been asleep? Am I the equivalent of Rip Van Winkle, that I went to sleep and there's been a peace process that's taking place that I was unaware of? There isn't any peace process. Palestinians aren't interested in peace. But the bottom line is, you get people who stand up and make those statements, and because they've got the title professor in front of their name, gullible minds can be brought into the misconception that they are speaking from a fount of knowledge, which quite frankly they're not.
And also, how much is this politically motivated, and how much of this is because of sponsorship and funding by Arab regimes into our universities, particularly our social sciences departments?
I've always said that our opponents on these matters are well organised and they are extremely well funded. I mean, when you look at for example, there's TV stations that are set up and they just run these stories all the time. Al Jazeera is one of them, owned by the Qatari state, and it's often used by people to suggest, well, there's been this article in Al Jazeera. I say, well, who cares? Quite frankly, they're not. This TV station, this media operation is run by the Qatari government, who have very strong views on a number of different points. So, in terms of our opposition, they're well funded, they're well organised, but there's another part of it, Simon, and this goes back to when I was first offered the opportunity to come onto Revelation TV. We have let them become more powerful than they actually are, because we neglected working hard and campaigning. We allowed the narrative to be filled by their narrative, which means that now we're pushing them back all the time, and the more numbers and more people get involved across the United Kingdom, the more successful we will be. But we have to demonstrate that their narrative is wrong, and we've got one great weapon they haven't got, and that is we're speaking the truth.
Absolutely. And also, regarding Israel Apartheid Week, it seems very much like they're adopting the BDS, the Boycott, Divestments and Sanctions movement, and just essentially it's just an Israel hate fest, isn't it? Because if they cared about the Palestinians, truly cared about the plight of the Palestinians, then they talk about the plight of the Palestinians living in the Arab world and the horrendous treatment they're facing of their fellow Arab brothers. I mean, in Iraq, the Palestinians are facing on the verge of being ethnically cleansed. They're treated in Jordan and Lebanon and Syria worse than third-class citizens. And yet, why are they singling out Israel when their so-called Arab brothers are actually treating them in a far worse way than Israel ever could or ever would?
Well, the Boycott, Divestments and Sanctions campaign is part of the equation that Israel Apartheid Week works on. They go back and they look in history and they see that South African apartheid was brought down by international sanctions across a whole different ranges of our lives, whether it be academic, whether it be social, sports, or economic. And they think that if they can successfully draw that analogy, then they can improve their boycotts, divestments and sanctions movement. But you know something, many people, this is one of the problems and why perhaps our demographic, in terms of we have got the older and wiser and sager citizens who support our campaigns, but people forget actually what the Palestinians have done to their own people. I made this point in the debate last week at UCL. If you look at how UNRWA was set up, initially there was 700,000 refugees, and this was this definition of people who were born or were in the land between X date and Y date. Now, if those refugees had been normal refugees, then they would have been resettled in other countries, or if there were still refugees, there would only be 20,000 of them left. The demographics mean that a lot of people have passed away. There are now 5.5 million Palestinian refugees. Some of them have never even been anywhere near the Middle East because of this crazy UNRWA definition which gave people hereditary rights. Now, why is that important? Here's why it's important, Simon. As a former trade union negotiator, there's one thing that the international community was so gullible, and it's beyond belief that they did this. In any negotiation, the clock is an important factor. Because if you think time's running out, then you have to make decisions and try and get the best deal for whoever you're representing. Now, the Arab nations didn't want these refugees. They deliberately didn't want them. So they got this UNRWA to create this new definition of a refugee, which means that rather than that number diminishing every year and the clock running out, that number increases every year. And they've got even more cannon fodder to allow the people that they allegedly lead to live in penury and not get the opportunity to live a decent life that you and I take for granted and your viewers take for granted. It's a scandal. But every single wound that's been inflicted on the Palestinian people, or let's be honest with you, the Arab people who lived in that part of the world, has been inflicted upon them by their own leaders.
Absolutely. Let's have a look at this extremely interesting video. It's entitled, "Does Israel Discriminate Against the Arabs?"
Maybe you've heard someone say that Israel is an apartheid state, that Israel has a policy of segregating and oppressing the minority population within its borders, like South Africa once did. Maybe you've been so outraged by this information that you have considered joining the BDS movement, the effort to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel until it ends its alleged racist policies. I don't blame you. Apartheid is a great evil and deserves to be fought wherever we find it. But here's the thing, you won't find apartheid in the state of Israel. So, I'll put it bluntly. The BDS movement is a slick propaganda effort built on lies. I think I have the credibility to make this claim. Having grown up in South Africa and having spent a fair amount of time in Israel, I know what apartheid is and what it is not. My parents were raised under real apartheid, where blacks were, by law, separated from whites at every level, from education to drinking fountains. Blacks couldn't vote, couldn't own land, couldn't live next to or use the same transportation system as whites. I remember my father telling me about how my grandfather was kicked and humiliated in public by a young white boy. All he was permitted to say was, "Please stop, little boss." That was the world my family lived in. That was the world of apartheid South Africa. But in Israel, the law is colorblind. Israeli Arabs have the same rights as Israeli Jews. They ride the same buses, study in the same schools, and are treated in the same hospitals. Arabs are elected to Israel's parliament, serve as judges, and fight in the Israeli military. On my first trip to Israel, the group I was with had a Jewish tour guide and an Arab bus driver. Imagine our surprise having heard that Israel is an apartheid state. This would have been inconceivable in apartheid South Africa. All these things would be self-evident to anyone who did any kind of actual research, or even better, visited Israel, something I encourage everyone to do. BDS doesn't want you to research or visit Israel. It depends on the ignorance of its audience. Sadly, on American college campuses, BDS has a significant presence. It succeeds by playing on the good intentions of good people through deliberate deception. In short, they lie. And lies really make me angry because lies empower evil. Lies about blacks empowered apartheid in South Africa. Lies about Jews made the Holocaust possible. And lies about Israel are misleading a lot of good-hearted young people into opposing the only country in the entire Middle East that doesn't segregate and oppress its minority population. Just ask the next Egyptian Copt or Iraqi Christian you meet on campus. So the question people should really be asking is, what does the BDS movement want? The answer is simple. They want to destroy Israel. They can't do it militarily, so they try to do it through lies. They say that Jews have no historic claim to Israel. Lie. They say that Israel treats its Arabs as second-class citizens. Lie. They say that Israel doesn't want peace with its Arab neighbors. Lie. If you tell lies and you tell them often enough, people who don't know the truth start to believe them. The BDS movement's leaders barely tried to hide the charade. They will lie and say that they only want a Palestinian state living side by side with Israel. And then they say this: we oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. Ending the occupation doesn't mean anything if it doesn't mean upending the Jewish state itself. That's from Omar Barghouti, a founder of BDS. Barghouti lives in Israel, so you might expect that he said this from inside an Israeli prison like Nelson Mandela during South Africa apartheid. You would be wrong. Barghouti is a PhD student at Israel's Tel Aviv University, where he enjoys the same rights as every Israeli. My parents could only dream of that kind of freedom. Is Israel a perfect country? No. There are as many perfect countries as there are perfect people. But to call it an apartheid state is not only an insult to the only democracy in the Middle East and the only country with equal rights for all its minorities, it's also an insult to the actual victims of apartheid, like my parents and all those who suffered under it. I'm Olga Mishra for Prager University.
I think that puts the record straight. Michael, that presentation made me very angry, primarily because, you know, for those South Africans that endured the horrendous years of apartheid, where they faced incredible discrimination, not being able to go on the same buses, not being able to drink from the same water fountain, not to be able to go in the same shops and treated like third-class citizen. And yet we see that in Israel, we see that Israeli Arabs, for example, serve on Israel's Supreme Court. They're represented in the Israeli parliament. They have their own press. They can vote. And there is no discrimination between Jew and Arab whatsoever. So it just shows, doesn't it, that those behind the Israel Apartheid Week are spilling nothing but lies. So why is it that we actually tolerate these harmful and dangerous lies in our society, in our politics, and also at our universities?
Well, I think that's a tremendous video, and what more powerful testimony could you have than someone who's actually got a family history and knows what South African apartheid was really like. There is no reason or explanation for how people can be so misled, but I think the lady in the last video demonstrated that, and it's the old, I think it was Harold Wilson, the a lie's halfway around the world before a truth has got its boots on. That it strikes me that that's the main issue, and what we really have to do is to put is to give this the attention that it requires and give it the seriousness that it requires, and that's why our campaign focuses on this IHRA definition that the government has created. And if Theresa May says that she has adopted that definition and people still breach it, then it is utterly logical that you then go back to the person and say, right, you have said that you're adopting this definition. Here's strong evidence that it is being breached. Now, what are you going to do about it? And the government try to do two things at the same time. They try to say that they're against racism in all its forms, and then they allow these things to happen. The two are incompatible. There is one thing which is a huge irony. There is discrimination in Israel, because you will know, Simon, having visited the country many times, that if you go to Jerusalem and you go into Temple Mount, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is, then Jewish people aren't allowed to pray on that ground for fear of offending.
Christians aren't either.
And Christians aren't either, for fear of offending the Muslims who are going to Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Yeah, who use it to play football and have barbecues.
And the bottom line is, so therefore, it's utter hypocrisy. We bend over backwards to ensure that people aren't discriminated against, but yet, when the same attacks take place in our country, we're doing nothing about it. It's got to stop.
Michael, would you introduce your new campaign video that you produced on this campaign?
Yes, I'll look straight into the camera and say that every time that we run a campaign, we try to make it as interesting and as educational as possible so that people understand what we're trying to achieve. So we have put together a short video which is encouraging as many people as possible to once again become a keyboard warrior for Israel. Get in front of your computer, join our campaign, and I hope you enjoy this short video.
In response to the work of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, Britain will be adopting a formal definition of anti-Semitism. We must teach every generation to fight hatred and prejudice in all its forms.
Attacks on Jewish people in the UK have hit record levels. In the last year alone, the charity that monitors anti-Semitic abuse recorded 1,382 hate crimes. That's a 3% increase on 2016 figures. It is the highest figure since statistics were first recorded 34 years ago. Israel Apartheid Week breaches the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. Yet right now in universities across the UK, extremists are organising Israel Apartheid Week events. Don't stay silent. Join our fight against the world's oldest hatred, anti-Semitism. Join millions of people across our country who abhor racism. Click on the link in the video description and call on the Prime Minister to honour her 2016 words. Simultaneously, send a message to universities across the UK that we will record every anti-Semitic event that takes place on their campuses, and we will present that evidence directly to the Prime Minister. It's important that we remember the message in these words. All that is needed for evil to succeed is that good people do nothing.
So please join Michael's campaign and the campaign of Israel Britain Alliance to put pressure on our government to stop the Israel Apartheid Week. I think we have to learn from history, really, in the dying moments of the programme, and sense that Israel Apartheid Week is linked to the BDS, and it's also linked to the banning of Israeli academics and links with Israeli universities. And essentially, it's a fundamental attack not only on Israel, but also on the Jewish people. And surely this is something that all of us, if we care about freedom, and if we care about democracy, and if we care about Israel and the Jewish people, then we cannot be apathetic and do nothing.
Well, absolutely. I couldn't put it better myself. And we chose the words very carefully at the end of the video, Simon. Because, you remember, there was a film that you told me you went to see, and it was about when the Channel Islands were invaded by the Nazis, and there was a film made recently, and I watched it on Netflix, and it showed some fantastically brave people protecting innocents, protecting people who were being brutalised by the Nazis. And the words at the end of the video that we made are from Edmund Burke, that great statesman who said that, and we paraphrase him, that all that is needed for evil to succeed is for good people to do nothing. There's lots of good people watching this show, and we encourage them to make their voice heard, because unless we do that, this evil will succeed. Israel Apartheid Week won't go away, and our victory will be, brick by brick, dismantling the whole concept of Israel Apartheid Week and the deep-rooted anti-Semitism that lies beneath it.
Within 30 seconds, Michael, can you just explain how our viewers can get involved in the campaign? I know you've already done it, but could you do it again?
Yeah, well, we now have a pretty sophisticated and straightforward mechanism for participation in our campaigns. If you go to our website, which is on screen just now, www.israelbritain.org.uk, and click on our current campaign, the campaign is live. In the first page, you fill in your Christian name and your surname and add your email address. And on the second page, all you need to do is put in your postcode, click the button, that will find your address, and it will find your MP. So please, help us in this campaign.
Michael, thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report. Always a pleasure. Thank you. And I just want to thank you for watching this programme today. We can't allow something like Israel Apartheid Week to take place. We can't allow our universities to be filled with hatred towards Israel and the Jewish people, and it's got to stop. So I can encourage you all to pray about this, but also get active and send an email to your political representative in the House of Commons to say this needs to stop. And so thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
No. People say Israel's an apartheid state, but I can't relate to that baseless hate. It's not really fair to try and compare a racist regime with the war on terror. Using common sense against violence, Israel had to build up the border fence. And if you think that's apartheid, it's because you don't know what apartheid really was. For 2,000 years the Jews all roamed, but we always called Israel our home. Unlike the British and Dutch who came to South Africa where they had no claim. They already had countries overseas, but they wanted to expand with new colonies, so they conquered the natives, bought and sold their land they stole full of diamonds and gold. The whites united and decided to create South Africa as a democratic state, but soon they denied blacks voting rights, so the whole government was controlled by whites. The House and the Senate and all of the courts were white, so the black people got no support. Plus the police would arrest and beat any peaceful protesters in the street. They divided everybody into 4 different races, moved them by force into separate places. So if you were Indian, black or brown, you had no business in no white town. They had segregation of transportation, buses, bus stops, trains and train stations, separate ambulance, different doctor and nurse, and the black hospitals were always worse. Restaurants, hotels, and the public park might be off limits if your skin was dark. It was a crime, and you could get more than a fine if you crossed the line of that whites only sign. They had separate teachers at different schools, black and white beaches and swimming pools, cafes and movie theaters wouldn't let folks in, discriminating if they had the wrong color skin. No mixed marriage, it was a criminal act for a white person to have sex with a black. Apartheid went from the womb till the tomb, couldn't even take a dump in the same bathroom. People say Israel's an apartheid state, but I can't relate to that baseless hate. It's not really fair to try and compare a racist regime with the war on terror. Using common sense against violence, Israel had to build up the border fence. And if you think that's apartheid, it's because you don't know what apartheid really was. In Israel, apartheid is not the case, cause regardless of gender, religion, or race, all Israeli citizens, black, brown, and white, have equal social and political rights. So the Arab Israeli population, which makes up 20% of the nation, might be a minority, but at least they can vote, unlike the rest of the Middle East. Look at the whole region, you'll see only Israel is truly a democracy, where every citizen's right to vote is protected and Arab officials often get elected. That's an important point, let me stress it. There's a dozen Arabs with seats in the Knesset, plus an Arab judge on the Supreme Court, so they don't fall short on government support. Everyone has access to the same schools, same beaches and the same swimming pools, the same resorts and hotel guest rooms, same public parks and public restrooms, same cinemas, restaurants, cafes, same trains, buses, taxis, and highways, same doctors and nurses. All deliveries of babies are done in the same facilities. Arab Israeli life expectancy is great, up by 27 years since 1948, and their infant mortality rates have have declined from 32 per thousand to less than 9, and they're doing much better economically relative to every other Arab country. There's no restriction on choice of career. They're welcome in the military. If they volunteer, they can work and reside wherever they please, from Eilat all the way to the Sea of Galilee. They live in the very same cities as Jews, on the same street, in the same house if they choose. People say Israel's an apartheid state, but I can't relate to that baseless hate. It's not really fair to try and compare a racist regime with the war on terror. Using common sense against violence, Israel had to build up the border fence. And if you think that's apartheid, it's because you don't know what apartheid really was.